Welcome, everybody. This is Matt Gwynn for the Kingian Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, and this is Kingian Nonviolence Community of Practice Training Web Event call. Tonight's focus is tools for organizing and mobilizing, and we'll get into all that content in just a little bit with our featured speaker, David Jehnsen. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Samuel Sarpia to say a little bit about the community of practice.
Thank you, Matt. I know, like I said to you guys, I will talk in and out for a meeting that I had that's standing that I probably in the next 7 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes, I'll talk out for a while. The Kingian Nonviolence Community of Practice is a group of practitioners that seek to weave and connect our work as we reflect with each other. And we do this by way of intentionality of sharing where we are in the journey of nonviolence community organizing, as well as we in our organizing work. And the community of practice it's a place where leadership is developed. We kind of coach each other as well as learn from each other, share each other's stories, share each other's experience, and grow together. And it's a community of practice where we're all leaders and practitioners across the country. And I think sometimes we have people joining us from far and beyond, where we learn each other's stories, their victories, their challenges, their successes, as well as how can we empower and encourage each other to move forward in this work of organizing and helping to bring justice and peace and shalom in the world that we live in. So this community of practice is just, I see 4 of us that have been a part of this community of practice, which is Matt, Ashley, David Jehnsen, and myself. And am I missing someone, Matt? I don't think so. There are other participants in this community of practice that we meet. Our meeting used to be every month, but somehow in the last couple of months, either I have called into the wrong meeting also. But that's a little bit about the Kingian community of practice.
Great. Thanks, Samuel. And some opportunities for getting connected are web events like this one. There are online Kingian nonviolence briefings at least a couple times a year. There is a Kingian Nonviolence Coordinating Committee that works to put together events like this. And that really came out of the first couple of cohorts that Chris on the call is a member of the current Beyond the Dream cohort, which is part of the work that you helped get started, Jonathan. Together, Jonathan and Kazu and I came to David about 4 or 5 years ago to say, let's do some more advanced leadership development. And so Jonathan was part of that from the very beginning. So there is that. There are 6-month cohorts that happen now. The next one will be starting in January. And the Kingian Nonviolence Network Facebook group. So there's about 500 people who are in that group. So if you're interested in any of those things, please follow up with me. This event today is part of a larger context of trying to build community around this material so that we can all grow and be victorious in the struggles and campaigns and initiatives that we're developing. So we're here for each other and we're all on our journey. I'm going to pass it to you, Radia, to set us up for the breakout groups to check in.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. So so we're going to take about 10 minutes now. I'm going to divide everyone into breakout groups. So we have an uneven number of people. So there'll be 2 to 3 people per room. And I just want everyone to take 10 minutes to introduce yourself to your group. Share a little bit about your location and why you are in this meeting today. So I'm going to break you guys up now, and we'll come back for large group in about 10 minutes. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, I'm doing pretty good.
Good.
I don't know how good my connection is going to be here. I had to shut off my Wi-Fi, so I'm just on the cellular network, and it's been kind of weak today. So we'll just see what we get.
Okay, well, I will bear with you, and we'll just hope that all goes well.
Okay.
All right, so I guess I'll just start briefly by introducing myself to you. My name is Radia Shabazz. I currently work as a racial justice organizer with On Earth Peace. And it's funny, this has actually been an insanely busy week for me. I just started a master's program at the University of Chicago. So
Nice.
I've been here for like a week, and so it's just been a lot of transition. But I wasn't very familiar with organizing and mobilizing, and especially like in the nonviolence and Kingian context. So that was something that was introduced to me in my work at On Earth Peace, and it's new to me. And so I really just welcome any and all opportunities to learn more. I'm hoping that in the near future I can actually start some of those trainings and get the certifications necessary to do the work. But right now it's definitely something that I'm using to assist with my racial justice work, just because we're in really trying times and there's a lot of conflict and chaos and I think trauma. So what I'm trying to do is really make sure that I incorporate the nonviolence approach and how we're responding to these situations, particularly because I do work with like student organizations and student groups and younger generations. So I guess in some sense, millennials. And so typically what I've found is that they have a lot of frustration and a lot of pent up righteous anger, but there's really no outlet for them on how to affect change or actually do something with the emotions that they're feeling. So I'm hoping that with these meetings and with the information that's gained, I can take that back to them and, we can kind of develop ways to actually respond appropriately to what's going on.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Bill Hammond, if you didn't catch that already. And I'm here in Flint, Michigan. And I think you probably know a little bit about what's going on here. And I'm about to be in the same position you are in learning about Kingian Nonviolence and how all that works. We're going to be doing, it looks like probably we're going to be doing that 2-day training. And I'm not sure if it's directly with you guys or if it's through you and with somebody else. But anyway, we just started talking about that last week, so it's in pretty early stages. And we're hoping to gather together a group of maybe as many as 15 people to all kind of partake of that at the same time. And actually, some of the group is meeting tonight to do some initial talking about that. At least I think they are. They were supposed to, but I haven't heard. Sure. But anyway, so that's kind of what's going on here. Our water situation has been ongoing. There's been a lot of talk back and forth. There's a lot of people talk about any kinds of racial injustice issues around the water because they feel like the relief efforts, I guess, maybe that's the way to say it, because the people would like to have the story get out that we've all rallied together and it's been a great pulling together of the community to work on this. And so talking about any kinds of racial problems tends to go counter to that belief on the part of some people. But others look past what's happening right.
Uh-oh.
Okay, I'm back. again. So instead, are looking at the root causes, and everybody seems to be able to together see that the root causes are definitely tied up in the issues of racial injustice. So that's kind of where I've been concentrating most of my effort around the water in the last maybe 2 months, is to focus people's attention away from what's actually happening here in town, and instead focusing on what the causes were and whether or not we can change any of that. We recently had a court decision that came down against the people, if you will, and sided on the side of the governor and the legislature in saying that the emergency manager law was not unconstitutional. And so, but that's all they ruled on. So there's still plenty of other room to attack it on. And people are kind of in a holding pattern right now, because that just happened last week. And so people are still trying to decide what's the next move. So anyway, that's kind of stuff we've been going through.
Yeah, I mean, and it's good work, because I remember when it was so like widely reported in the news,
Yes.
and now you hear absolutely nothing. And it's
Right.
something that my mom has been following. She's actually been an environmental justice, or I guess you could say an environmental injustice advocate for the last 20 years.
Okay.
My brother was actually poisoned by lead when he was 18 months old, and so she kind of took up the cause and founded a nonprofit in Richmond, Virginia, where I'm from. So it was definitely like eye-opening to see that there's still this major issue happening, and that was in 1996 when he was poisoned, and to think about the gains that have been made in the last 20 years, but kind of see that there's been more of the same, especially in like marginalized communities, where there's underrepresented people or low income people, to see kind of how those things are still happening was just like eye-opening. So it's, it's work that definitely needs to be done.
It's taken a long time for people to realize what's really been happening, but this really all started back with the Reagan administration. And the issue of he called it trickle-down economics, and we all just call it Reaganomics. The term they use now to describe it is austerity economics. And what has really happened is everywhere across the country, we have starved our municipalities at every level of needed revenue, and so our infrastructure has not been maintained. We've got crumbling bridges, roads, and of course water and sewer everywhere. And the number of communities across this country that have lead pipes is astronomical. People just don't get that yet. They're starting to slowly understand that almost every city in the U.S. has the same potential problem. And really, they needed to be involved 15 or 20 years ago with starting to replace those. And of course, they're not. So communities that are like the age of Flint or older, like Detroit, of course, are experiencing much worse problems. Certainly on a scale level they are, because there's so much of it that's deteriorating. Even here in Flint, even though we're only 170 or so years old, we actually still have some wooden water mains downtown. And nobody in their right mind would ever think that in 2016 anyone would have wooden water mains anywhere. But I'd be willing to bet that Detroit has got, 5 or 6 times the amount of wooden mains still under their streets that we have here, just because of how, Detroit is the second oldest major city in the country. It's over 300 years old, and people don't get that.
Yeah. So
we're just starting to have. Is Flint what?
Is it also a blighted community at this point?
A blighted?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Oh, very much so, of course, because, we've lost over half of our population and didn't have the resources to steadily tear down houses as they were abandoned. But we have gotten significant amounts of money at 2 or 3 different times, and so we have made pretty substantial inroads. I think our overall number of houses as a percentage of the total is probably still a lower percentage than what Detroit is experiencing, But Detroit, of course, because of scale, seems like it's much worse. So we've been a little bit fortunate there. There was one time when we got a grant that was almost exactly equal to what Detroit got, and virtually nobody else in the state got it because our problem was so severe. But most of the time, you know, ours is proportional for our size. So we're doing a lot of that kind of clearing of blight. The city doesn't have the personnel to manage any of their departments properly. All of the parks and all of the vacant land now are maintained by volunteers. We do have a land bank, which is the very first in the country ever. Here, it's where it all started from. And the land bank now owns almost every vacant parcel in the city. And they don't have the resources to maintain the lots that they own either on the way that they should be able to. So they have two programs. They have one called a Clean and Green, which is a grant that'll go to a group, and a group will maintain a minimum of 30 lots. And so those lots get cut more regularly, but the other ones are only going to get cut once the entire year. So there's a lot of volunteers that are doing all that kind of stuff too. So
Totally.
Yep.
Excellent. Looks like we're being ushered back to the
Yeah,
room.
that does.
So I will see you there. Great to
Okay.
see you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the breakout groups. And we've got someone who wasn't here when we broke out. So would you introduce yourself, Mr. Miller?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I live in Monterey, California, and I'm on the board of the local Monterey Peace and Justice Center. And we recently took a Kingian workshop that was put on by a gentleman from Berkeley. So we're interested in continuing the discourse within our organization and to begin to spread the word among our community relative to Kingian practices.
All right. Glad you're here. And we're going to launch into the evening's material. So I hope that you had good connections in your breakout groups with one another. And I'm going to pass it over to David. Just a reminder as we move into this presentation part that it's just the way we run things that we keep everybody muted except for the main speaker because sometimes there can be really bad feedback. So just don't take it personally if you see that one of the hosts has muted you, unless it's right in the middle of when you're speaking. But don't take it personally if you get muted. And those of you who are on the phone, we will check in with you at any of the Q&A times if we do mute you. So you won't be left out if you're just on the phone. So you can also be in charge of your own self-muting and unmuting. So here we go. I'm going to turn it over to David. David, this is an overview and introduction to content, and then moving into application to current work. And then we'll have about 5 minutes of Q&A and response before we go into the main presentation. So this is David Jehnsen, who's the co-author of the Kingian Nonviolence Curriculum, together with Bernard Lafayette Jr. And I'll let him speak more to whatever you'd like to say about himself, or just to launch right into the material. Go for it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I am just so thrilled that here we are dealing with third and fourth generation people. In 1964, when Bernard Lafayette and I began in Chicago on the West Side, even while Martin Luther King was still alive, our objective was that this should be available to the next 3 or 4 generations. And that since that was after the March on Washington, we also iterated that people should have more to talk about than just "I have a dream" speech. They needed to talk about the philosophy and the strategy. And tonight's session is the second phase of a program we did in March. And that March program is available for you to access by YouTube, I believe, through Ready or Matt Gwynn. Ready, you, I guess, have the posting. So we discovered we had more material than fit the 90-minute profile at that time. And so we decided we'd schedule a second phase, which is tonight, for this mobilizing and organizing. Now, tonight, we're dealing with a team of people in the Kingian Advanced Program who are going to take it to the next 2 or 3 generations. So we are really excited about this. And, you know, it's just nothing better to see than new leadership adapt ideas and illustrations and concepts and organizing practice than we experienced. And so as far as I'm concerned, this is just a great joy to be a part of this group with you. The very interesting thing of the topic tonight, and that was the topic for the March call, was community practice call, is that we're looking at how international networks of nonviolent social movements help to shape and codify the Kingian nonviolence movement. The Kingian nonviolence movement still is something very unique in the world, in that, for example, in India, people say, well, Gandhi created the method and Martin Luther King and his colleagues copied it. Well, that's not quite true. And the Indians were the first to recognize that about 30 years ago when they discovered that something new and creative had emerged internationally and in the United States and North America about nonviolence that hadn't happened in India. In India, you had a 99% Indian population dealing with a 1% English opposition and oppressor. In the United States, you had a 20% African American population oppressed by a system that represented, allegedly, 80% of white America. And so the movement in the United States was dealing with very different realities than they dealt with nonviolence in India. And so, but we were blessed when Martin Luther King was involved in the Montgomery movement, that people like Bayard Rustin, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the American Friends Service Committee, some of the Church of the Brethren people, some Mennonite people, had all been a part of international nonviolent networks that exchanged training concepts and tools. And Richard Hauser was the source, and his wife Hepzibah were the source of many of these conceptualizations that helped to codify what we're talking about, nonviolence, in some very concrete ways. And I first, how many received and had a chance to read the 3 or 4 paragraphs I sent out, that was sent out? Anybody else? Okay, good. Well, then I won't
The
bore
yes on the chat too.
Oh, I see. Okay. But basically, I ran into some of this material in 1963 with Bayard Rustin and didn't connect the dots until 1968 with Richard Hauser. And it was quite an experience because I have such respect for both men and their experiences. And of course, Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin and Jim Farmer from the Fellowship of Reconciliation were the people who provided tutorial support for Martin Luther King to learn more about nonviolent social movements. He had studied academically the roots of nonviolence, and that's how he wrote The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. But his experience with nonviolent movements all descended from people like Howard Thurman, Richard Gregg, people who will be in the second phase of this call webinar. So it's really remarkable when you put the experience we had here in the United States into an international intellectual history context. And so these community practice calls are attempts to, where the rubber meets the road, to make those links so that we can understand how some of this material came about and how it helped Lafayette and myself shape what is known as the Kingian Nonviolence Curriculum and Program. So that's really the framework. And if you look at those 4 paragraphs, you can see some of the chronology and history, intellectual history that traces this, but that's a background in the context for today's session. Now, should we go on to its application?
Sure. Why don't you say a couple more words about that, and then we'll open it up for some quick questions before we move into the main presentation.
Okay. In the first session in March on this material, which was really, the topic was organizing and mobilizing nonviolence movements, we were able to look at the relationship between charisma, anti-charisma, and the turnaround, and how groups get organized. The paternalistic system is based on a charismatic paternalistic model. And people have to grow out of that with a turnaround that in the initial stages is often very anti-negative. In other words, people are for what they're against, but they're not for what they're for. They haven't figured that out yet, or what the solution is. And then after the turnaround is the respect relationship. We're going to revisit that tonight in another format, an organizing format, but basically the respect relationship was a foundational basis for the democratic way of life and nonviolent social change and common purpose, etc. And there are lots of stories that we told, and like I said, that you can get information from the previous recording of that call. We also talked about different types of leadership, the power leader, the influence leader, the establishment power leader. And it's important to understand those distinctions. And the introduction of the 6 categories of leadership, but we didn't really go into how that translates into the organizing format, which we're going to do tonight. So let's open it up. If there's some questions before we get into tonight's session. I'm open for it.
Great. Thank you, David. So I'll have about 5 minutes if anybody wants to respond or ask questions to the intro that David's provided so far. And we're a small enough group that I think you can just unmute yourself. And I'll mute you, Jonathan, so that you're ready to jump in if you want to. Or I can't. Radia, would you do that? I don't have privileges anymore. Great. Would someone like to jump in with a comment or a question? And welcome, Samuel Adet.
Okay, I'll jump in. I don't have a question, but I had a point of clarification. I think it's interesting, David, what you said, and I hope I'm getting this right, that people are not for what they're for, they are for what they're against. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that a little bit?
Yes. It comes down to the concept of protest versus proactive movements. Protests are what people are against, and they're usually kind of one-shot deals. They're a reaction to a wrong situation. And they're a part of the process that groups have to go through often before they learn that they have to develop a proactive process that both works on prevention and intervention. So it comes down to those two concepts, and it's just a dimension of that. And the anti-negative is the paternalistic racialist system is wrong. And people have to shed themselves of their dependence on that, where they adapt to it. And I mean, even the person that parks a car and wears a uniform in front of the Ritz Hotel identifies with that paternalistic system. And of course, we know so many analogies from the history of African Americans in this country, where I was in banking. Well, you know, and so to shed that, to throw that off, you would immediately move into an anti-negative. You know what you're against. And when you know what you're against, that's an intermediate stage in change. But it only works for positive change if you move proactively to the next level, which is a respect relationship with everybody you're working with, and the foundational basis of a social movement based on nonviolence and the democratic way of life. Does that help?
Very much so, thank you.
I thought it was
Someone else?
Ashley,
go.
add to that, I thought it was interesting that the folks at Standing Rock had framed, like, so much in the media, they're framed around being protesters. And even in their language, it was like, we are water protectors, we are
Right.
stewards of the land, the land, and in looking towards the future. And I mean, I know this is just like a microcosm example, but I thought it was really powerful how they were controlling the message to sort of, instead of being against something, showing what they were for.
That was so major. I was so happy to see that. And I knew that about their philosophy, but I was just so happy to see them push that, because a lot of groups don't push it. Some people thrive on the protest phase and want to stay there. The anti-negative phase.
I think that that choice of language has a lot of impact, because often the natural progression is from protester to terrorist in terms of the optics, right? And so I think it's not just a way of claiming this positive term, protector, in light of their own relationship to the land, but in controlling the message in the predominantly white media that looks at persons of color who respond to the government by protesting as somehow being more devious or mischievous than we actually are. And so I think that's just an interesting aspect of what David and Ashley were talking about.
And I think it's incumbent upon movements and campaigns to continually reiterate this distinction. And I thought it was brilliant what the people of Standing Rock did by making that emphasis, because we don't have enough groups. Like, we've all experienced the 5th year anniversary of the Occupy movement, and we never characterized it in these terms as an anti-negative versus a proactive movement. And so many modern campaigns and movements fail to make this distinction and don't frame it in a way that forces the media and others to cover it in this way.
So, friends, I think it's time for us to move forward to the next piece of material, which is the main content for the evening. This is a rich conversation, and I'm just kind of wading in to cut it off, because I think we can keep going for a little bit. And I want there to be plenty of time to interact with the material that David's bringing for this next section. So, David, I'll turn it over to you. And let me see, Ashley, or Radia, I can share my screen. So when you're ready, David, you tell me, and I'll share my screen.
Okay, let's do that because I want to start with the 5 phases of organizing and mobilizing and group development.
Okay, just a second.
I think there's some slides or something.
Yeah, let me try and get this going. Slideshow.
There we go.
Okay, do you see, is it full screen? Can someone give me some feedback? Or are you just seeing my entire PowerPoint screen, or are you seeing only the slide?
Both. I'm seeing both.
Yeah, it's the entire screen, Matt.
Or,
I think if you click from beginning, it'll probably show just a PowerPoint
I
slide.
put it off on my other screen. Just a second. Well, David, you can go ahead and start talking, and I will try and get it to be bigger on everyone's screen.
Okay.
In the meantime.
This phase of group development is important because groups just don't stand up and walk and then run all at one time. They go through a process of turnaround, and we've talked about the paternalistic, the respect phase, and the anti-negative phase. But until people reach a solidarity phase, which is, damn it, I'm going to do something about this, or we're going to do something about this, we're going to change this. When people reach that level of solidarity, then things can happen. Cesar Chavez told a lot of great stories about the fact that that was the most important step. He would go visit a farm if people were able to get the 5 to 7 people or 3 to 5 people together, besides the one individual that wanted him, because he would break the paternalistic issue and move to the respect level, and then try to cajole and provoke them into being mad enough to do something about it themselves. Once this happens, then, and this is what Highlander did with 17,500 people, and we'll cover that in the phase 2 program, but the solidarity phase is so critical because people have to declare themselves willing to fight for themselves using whatever methods they could learn about nonviolent strategies. This leads to activation, and that's when leadership emerges, and that's when you do training. Now, as I mentioned in the handout that you received, Miles Horton had a great statement about the fact that training in times where there is no national social movement is different from training at times when there is a national social movement. Because when there is a national social movement, you've got a very specific agenda, and you're training people to implement and organize implementing activities, not just to develop activities. So, so the concept of activation is where a great deal of training takes place. And for me, there are 2 types of training. There's training that's prevention oriented, such as the kind of discussion we're having tonight, and training that is helping people learn how to organize and mobilize the campaign that they're already in. And so it took 2 weeks, for example, in Selma, after the initial emergence of the campaign, to train people in the nonviolent direct action after Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral and the March on Montgomery. And there were intensive trainings. Now, there had been trainings going on all along. Bernard Lafayette was there in 1962 for at least a year and a half. And he was doing training which was the development of leadership type of training. But they were training people for the March to Montgomery in terms of how to implement that march and prevent people from committing violence and how to keep the bigger picture on the screen. The activation phase can peter out. It can dwindle away unless there is training that is focused on changing conditions. And that's what we move to the vitalization phase, where democratic and self-governing of themselves and others independently is the reality. So that through arts and training and lifestyle changes, etc., the vitalization phase is basically where people are democratic for themselves and democratic for everyone else. And they work to achieve that balance with both internal and external purposes. So these phases of group development are things that every organizer is confronted with, and we have to help people through this process because basically we're catalysts, and catalysts have to inform people, but have to let people emerge and have to stimulate people to emerge from their experiences and learn to acquire skills and capacity to move on up the scale to the vitalization phase.
Why don't I just see if there's a quick question about that before we move to the next slide? And I'm going to stop the screen share. Can someone tell me, did it ever get to be the full screen of the slide, or was it always the PowerPoint?
It was
the entire PowerPoint picture. It went to the full screen? Okay. Then I think I know what to do for the next one.
Yeah,
Does anyone have a comment or a question? Okay, great, thanks. Does anyone have a question or comment about these phases of group development that David was breaking out?
Yeah, the democratic for themselves and democratic for everyone. I'm not sure, what does that mean? Does that mean like a small community makes decisions democratically, but they also participate in the global democracy?
Well, what we're talking about here is, okay, let's say you're training police officers in nonviolence, and the police officers union is democratic for themselves, but they're not necessarily democratic for the citizens that they're supposed to protect. And they're not necessarily democratic for their superiors. Likewise, as you move up the law enforcement ladder, you find that to be the case. People want to be democratic for themselves, like some church people, but they don't want to be democratic for the whole denomination. And so what we have to do is help people mature in their capacity, and that's what that level of vitalization is. And that can be the case with a group or a whole society. And for a whole society, it's through the arts, it's through all kinds of cultural experiences. It's just vitalization is the phase where people have reached human maturity, and that applies to groups too. And so, for example, we have experienced social movements that would become very democratic for themselves, but not very democratic for everybody else. And that's why coalition building in 2016 has been dwarfed by coalition building in 1963. And yes, times are different and all that stuff, but the fact of the matter is, it's where people's internal and external goals for vitalization were active. And so that's really what that's about.
Chris made a comment in the chat saying we are working on democratizing, so this is interesting for us. Do you want to make another statement, Chris, about what you're talking about?
That's just interesting.
In your context.
I feel like this is saying that, like, if we have different working groups, and the working group, like the tech working group, is democratic within themselves, and the animal care working group is democratic within themselves, but like maybe all of these working groups should be taking consideration of like everyone. But I feel like that depends on the decision. Like there's decisions that affect everyone, and if it affects everyone, then everyone should have a say. But if the decision doesn't affect anyone else, like what time is our meeting, only the people who are going to the meeting should vote on that. I don't know.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point here. Jonathan and Lewis, I'm glad you're on the call, because 6 or 8 years ago, we had breakfast here in Columbus with.
Could you unmute Jonathan Padilla in case he wants to make a comment?
Jonathan?
I just wanted to unmute him for his phone line.
Okay.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, he asked a question, how did this movement start? And I told him about the 1895 half and half movement of the dock workers and the mule team drivers in New Orleans. But I said, the interesting thing is that around 1900, a guy named Du Bois went to Germany to study philosophy with the Romanist philosopher people, and came back and wrote The Soul of Black Folks, The Nation Within a Nation. I said in 1932, Miles Horton went to Denmark to the Danish folk high schools, where a guy named Grundtvig, a Lutheran bishop, had gone to Germany and studied the same philosopher and the romanticism concept of folk, came back and started the folk high schools. Miles Horton brought the concept back to Highlander Folk School in 1932 in Tennessee. Jim Dombrowski came from the half and half movement in New Orleans to be one of the 3 people to start the Highlander Folk School. And all 3 of these people were shaped by the folk character of Romanticist philosophy. Now, so was Hitler, but in a very different persuasion. And so what we are looking at is the universality of certain ideas and the fact that they all point toward the democratic way of life, and that we have to be democratic for each other, and we have to be democratic for others, and our change philosophy has to be for democratic social change. It can't be top down or exclusively bottom up. It's got to be both.
I'm going to put the next slide up, and then we can move to the next place in the conversation. Will someone tell me if that's the full screen? Did I get the right one to share?
Yes,
Okay.
It's full screen. And these 6 categories, in order for preventing people from being single issue movements or campaigns, all the 6 steps of nonviolence that we've talked about elsewhere and the 6 principles, you address these basic 6 categories of leadership in a society and in a community. And you have to be dealing with people in each of these 6 categories. What we're going to talk about tonight is that these 6 categories, each one of them have the other 5 categories as subgroups. In religious groups, you have youth, you have progressive and voluntary associations and caucuses and so on and so forth. You have minorities and oppressed groups have special caucuses. You have people who work in government who are members of synagogues, mosques, and churches. You have people who are educators. You have Christian education programs, synagogue education programs, Muslim education programs, all after school. You basically have in these 6 categories 36 categories. And so what we like to say, and we're going to move on to this in a minute, is that if you get 36 of these groups and their subgroups from the top down, and 36 of these subgroups from the bottom up, you've got more than 70 people already, and I don't have to know anybody in your community. I can arrive at 10 o'clock at night and ask the question, who are these people? And they can be at a meeting at 6 o'clock in the morning during a crisis. And what we learned in the Kingian movement is that if you know how to articulate the sources of leadership in a community, you don't have to have been there 5 years. You can be there 24 hours. But you can help people step up to leadership themselves by you giving the people that invited you in the direction as to who to invite to respond to this shooting. And you can do that overnight, and because we know people will come to a meeting within 24 hours after a crisis. We know that if you wait 5 days, you get 20% of the people. And if you wait 2 weeks, you get 5% of the people. We know that. So we have to be prepared as catalysts and influence leaders and organizers and mobilizers to give direction to people that there are categories of leadership there that they have to be sure all are represented. We used to organize 2-day seminars basically on this 6-category process. 65 people, at least 5 from every category had to be in the training session before Bernard and I would do it. And so that, of course, has multiple meanings now. And so we're going to move to how do you translate identifying with your supporters to move to the next level, which is where we get these bottom-up and top-down categories, because you see, for each of the vertical categories that are citywide or national or statewide, you've got their local grassroots counterparts. You have an elementary school, a high school, etc., whereas you've got a school system over here. And so you have to work with both to bring this about in order to stimulate the top-down, bottom-up process, which we also discussed in another place. But now what we want to do, how do you translate that in the 70-plus people into an organizing context? And that's the next slide, unless there are some questions on this one.
Yeah, maybe we should stop for just a minute and see if there's, because that was kind of deep going into the 36 and the 6 and the 6, and maybe we take a moment to interact a little bit as a group before we move to the next stage.
Sounds good.
Who's got a comment or a question?
I think for me, it's actually a little bit more of a comment, like thinking about the minorities and oppressed groups, like so much, because divide and conquer within our groups is so popular of a place to keep us oppressed. It's really important to think about, like, what is the mainstream of your group and what are the margins of your group and how are those voices represented? Because things will not, you don't want to move forward without having all voices being heard. And I think that's where one place where we often, we, by our own privilege or lack of networking, just don't even think to, like, step outside of our own identities when trying to gather those people in a crisis moment. But if we don't think intentionally about that diversity, that's where it really hurts us in the long run.
I'm just trying to go through the mental process of figuring out the 36 boxes and what does that actually mean. And so, like, I'm thinking, well, if you start with minorities and oppressed groups from the top down, the left side, and you say, okay, so a national organization that works with minorities and oppressed groups is the NAACP, or I'm just going to try and walk through it. And then you say, well, then what's the youth, the grassroots youth component of the NAACP? So you're not just going to the NAACP, but you're looking for who are the youth that are connected to the NAACP. And then, but then the other side is, what are the national youth organizations and what is their, like, subgroup that serves the interests of minority and oppressed groups within the national youth organization? So that's, like, I'm just trying to think my way through what's actually in those 36 boxes that you're talking about. I don't know if that's helpful for anybody else, or if you have other examples that you're trying to, as you try and figure out what it looks like.
Well, if you take your example of the NAACP or the minorities and oppressed groups, they have a youth council, they have an organization of fraternities and sororities, they have an organization of business support, they have organizations of people that are minorities in government. You can go right across the board. And you could do that for many national organizations in the minority and oppressed groups category. Also, they have the local councils and the local branches. And the genius of this organizing philosophy, which Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin, who were very close colleagues and organizers during that whole period, because they both lived in Harlem and they related to each other constantly with this international network. That's why they were such good organizers, because they could understand that each of these groups had a subgroup, and even within the groups at the grassroots level, they had subgroups. So it becomes more complicated. We've simplified it to 70 plus for the purpose of training. But what happened in Selma is that because of the organization of these groups, they could feed 30,000 people a day voluntarily with fried chicken and greens and everything. They produced all kinds of stuff. And now, 30,000 people being fed in church basements during the period of the movement is a pretty dramatic organizing feat. And it just happened because all these folks were organized, all these subgroups were organized. In Birmingham, we read in that campaign about the Children's March and the work that the youth in the elementary and middle and secondary school contributed to that campaign. Why 3,000 of them went to jail at one time. And they were just a youth corps. So it's very important that we learn that there are categories of leadership fundamental to most communities that we've got to reach, and we've got to intensify the crisis so they'll come to a meeting at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Radia, I saw you put in a plus, which in our webinar culture is like applause or shaking it up for somebody. Do you want to speak to why you did that, Radia?
Sorry.
She's shaking her head.
I put that up in response to Ashley's point about thinking intentionally about diversity. I think that, like she said, like it's sometimes hard for us to come outside of ourselves and consider other groups within our communities or within certain populations. And I just, with constant conversation being had this week about diversity and oppression and how that impacts one's ability to do work, I just really wanted to give it up for that point. I think we have to just be deliberate about thinking about how we can be diverse and make sure that that's played out in our work and our action. So thank you, Ashley.
Any other comments or questions on this slide and what David presented? Or are we ready to move to the next one? I don't hear any. I'm not sure I see any. My video is a little slow right now, so speak up. We're going to go to the next one, David.
Okay.
Here we go.
Now, we kind of assembled these concepts into one unit here on organizing and mobilizing. So the first item is we basically put these people who come to that 7 o'clock in the morning meeting into a cabinet leadership role as a group. This is an emergency committee to address this particular crisis. And it's based on these 72 leaders plus from the 6 categories that were identified overnight. Now, sometimes this may take 24 hours, but at any rate, the purpose of this is for further training of them and to help them become empowered and develop the capacity to direct their own help in their own community. So the purpose of creating a formal cabinet that's for this emergency committee on such and such is to create a context in which they begin to function as a group, and that's totally people in that community. And that you are an outsider or a catalyst or a stimulator of that group, and you're training them, but there's a little tension between you and the group because you're challenging them to take control of their community and this issue. Now, what did they do? The first thing they do is they learn how to stimulate the community around them, their peers and their constituents, about these issues and problems. Because if the community is not aware and not being challenged, they go on about their business and say, oh, no skin off my nose, you know. I don't care. So-and-so got shot. Well, people get shot every day. Well, you see, the question is, can this leadership group help the community frame issues and understand these issues in a new context? That they're not just things that happen, they're things that happen as symptoms of a larger problem. The third thing that they do is to stimulate authorities that are indirectly involved in planning or responsibility for change. We talk a lot about the fact that there's an invisible infrastructure in communities and in a society that really makes the decisions, but they're not visible. They're not elected. They're not selected. For example, in St. Louis, the teachers were on strike, and they were on strike for 8 months in about 40 years ago. And the seniors in high school were not going to be able to complete high school and go to college in the fall, even though they had their invitations and their applications accepted because they didn't finish high school. Well, the young people decide to call on the bankers and the insurance brokers and all of these people that are indirect authorities and tell them just what's at stake here. And the result was they got together with the teachers union and the school board, settled a strike, set up a compensatory process for people to graduate on time, and so they settled the problem. So working with indirect authorities is very, very important. And so but you've got to target them. I remember in the Alabama campaign, we targeted the large paper industry. I forget the name of it right now. That produced about 60 or 70% of the paper in this nation for Xerox machines and mimeograph machines, which most people don't remember. And because they were making all kinds of money off the pulp mills in Alabama. So there were various examples through the history of these movements where people targeted indirectly involved planning. Pardon me. But you can't just stimulate indirect authorities. You have to go after the elected officials or the people who are directly responsible. Not that they are the cause of the problem, but they are in positions to make decisions to help change the problem. They can't change the problem or make decisions about the problem if there's no public pressure for them to do so. And so, for example, on the killing of black men that's been going on for a long time is not possible to solve without solving some of the problems of racial inequality and economic inequality in our society. But we need to focus on all three of those things on the elected officials because there are things that they can do and not just have community-oriented policing because that's not going to solve the problem. So we have to attack simultaneously all three of these things. Number two, to stimulate the community about issues and problems so that there's a massive force of people that are aware and in motion and ready to work to solve this problem. To focus on the indirect people who like to hide in the economic community, the political community, and so on, who aren't elected, but they like to stand behind the scenes and pull the strings. And then at the same time to stimulate the authorities directly responsible for solving these problems. You have to do all three things, because if you only do one or two of them, you can't create change. So this phase and this program in how we codify the organization and mobilization process is that groups have a process they go through that we can help them with. And we need to be sure we have our tool chest full and available to help them through that process. We need to help groups understand that they have to have multiple power groups in the community and leadership groups involved in the process. Otherwise, it'll end up being a single issue campaign. And we need to be able to orchestrate that and direct that with a group of leadership that are from that community or from that state or that society who direct the direct action activities on the community, the indirect authorities, and the direct authorities and elected officials to put pressure for change.
All right, thank you, David. Just looking at the clock and looking at the agenda, I think that what we'd like to do now is go back into breakout groups for about 5 minutes to talk about application of the ideas that we've been talking about this afternoon. Application to your own context. Application to your context in Monterey, in Flint, in Providence, to my context here in Portland, or we got Chicago, we got Eastern Washington, we got Dayton, Ohio, Bellingham, Washington, or to the projects that you're working on. What is the application of what we've been talking about to projects that you're working on and connections that you make as you try and connect it back to where the rubber hits the road for you? Badia, will you break us up for about 5 minutes?
Yes, I will do that right now.
Hey, how are you, Radia?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm all right.
Good. So we're supposed to be talking about application. And we only have 5 minutes, so I'll try to be like super concise. I'm still stuck on the point that he made in the beginning about like people are not what they're for what they're against. Like I just want to honestly explore that more and take it back to some of my classes, because we're actually in the midst of like talking about oppression and like social dominance and things like that. And then of course, like with the recent police shootings that we've seen, like a lot of that has come into conversation that we've been having about racial justice work and social justice as a whole. And so I was, I guess, intrigued by the protest versus proactive movement concept, because I think it makes perfect sense, but I don't think that we necessarily always think of things that way. So I think it's going to be a challenge to think differently and like share this with a group of like-minded students who are like organizing and passionate about this work and are doing this work in various ways. So kind of like, I guess, turning the idea of like protests on its head a little bit is going to be interesting to see how that works. But I think the main thing is just like, I want to take that back to group discussion and kind of see what people have to say about it. And then I think go from there.
Cool. And your master's degree is in
Social service administration.
social service administration.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like public administration?
A little bit. So it's like a mix of like social work and public administration, but you can either choose like a clinical route, which is more of the social work, or you can choose the social admin route, which is more of like the public admin and policy route, or you can do the mix of both. So like there's great divide in like the people who want to do clinical and the people who want to do like, you know, more of the policy side of things. And I'm kind of leaning towards social admin at this point.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that as well. I'm just tired. I'm exhausted. It's getting to the point where it's like, how do I do my job that requires me to be on social media and stop being on this damn social media where everybody, like, I can't scroll through my news feed without seeing all of this crap, you know, all the time. And it makes me think, like, am I only friends with people that, you know, are like posting these damn videos? Like, I can't watch another damn video, Radia. Like, and I feel like a lot of what we do is operating in this reactionary role, like David was saying, and you know, it makes me think, you know, what does proaction look like? And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Right.
You know? I mean, is it homeschooling our daughter so she can learn shit that they ain't gonna teach her, you know, in regular school?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
instead of reacting to, you know.
Right. And it's tough, I think, because I think people are so reactionary because when you see those things or you have those experiences, that's what fires you up, you know, to do the work. But if nothing is really happening or there hasn't been any significant event, like, I don't know, it's like people just become stagnant.
It's visceral. I agree.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, that's great, Mr. Brother. That's a great story.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's see, it looks like we have on the phone Samuel Sarpia. We lost Samuel Adet, who was in video, and it looks like Jonathan didn't make it back. So, oh, and Bill Hammond. Is anybody left in the groups for the everyone's back who's here? Okay, great. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. Before we move into our closing, I'd just like to open up some space, particularly focused on application. You know, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of a nonviolence geek, and I can talk about these ideas for a really long time, just at the beauty of the ideas. But this is a community not just of interest or intellect, but a community of practice. And so for these 5 minutes before we move into our closing, I'd really like to invite people who saw connections between the organizing work that you're doing or you want to do and the material that was shared tonight, or any contributions from other members of the community tonight. What's an insight that you're walking away with, or a question, or something you want to try? Like, let's talk about application for the next few minutes before we move towards our closing. Who wants to speak?
Well, I'd like to speak first. I found the PowerPoint charts to be very organized and very useful, and I would like to present those to the members of my committee as a structure that we can begin to focus on our training, to continue our training in Kingian Nonviolence. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, I see a lot of it as, useful, like directly, like immediately. Just thinking about democratizing, thinking about reaching out to, like, trying to categorize groups to make sure that we reach out to all of the appropriate people at the top and at the bottom, and doing that in a systematic way, breaking that down into steps that are, because it's like, I got to reach out to 72 people. It's like, no way. I have to break down 72 people, get a team together to reach out. Like, this person reaches out to that person, this person, that is more doable, and just taking these massive projects down, breaking them down into discrete projects that are doable.
But I think I would comment on that, Chris. In 1964, I created something called the West Side Federation on the west side of Chicago. And it was 54 organizations and congregations. And I worked with it for a year and a half. And then it became a full-fledged participant in the Chicago Freedom Movement with Martin Luther King. Today, they have built all kinds of housing developments on the site where Martin Luther King's apartment was. I didn't even realize, and I was 20 years old, 21 years old at the time, that what I had developed with that cabinet of 54 people, 54 organizations, would survive 50 years, more than 50 years, and now today is a productive and massive organization that doesn't even remember how it got started. And this year was the 50th anniversary of that Chicago Freedom Movement from 1966, and we started the West Side Federation in 54. And now, so if you look at the larger picture from the beginning, doesn't mean you're going to organize it at the beginning, but you're going to help it work into a being organismically. And it can last for decades. But many organizers are quick trippers, I call it. They like the joy of a campaign and a quick victory or loss, or, oh, wasn't that great, But they haven't created the context for people to be there 30 years later. Because what we have to remember as social change organizers is we're very transient people. And we have to keep in mind, what is it in the context that we leave behind that has developed a capacity to continue in their own way. And so it's just remarkable to look back and see these kinds of examples. So I know that there's frustrations in the micro situation, but we've got to keep our eye on the larger context as well. And where we have an opportunity, in my case, a very talented senior Black preacher was overweight and heavy and older. He's well recognized in Black religious history, W.W. Taylor. He finally told me after the Birmingham campaign, he said, David, he said, this clergy alliance has been great in bridging with the Southern movement and dealing with the House Un-American Activities Committee and the March on Washington. All this stuff has been great, but it's time to get some younger ministers involved. And he named a couple, and they served to the end. And they helped organize the 54 groups, and we did all kinds of projects together. And they voted against Alinsky coming into the West and chose the Freedom Movement instead as a model of organizing. But that was even after I was out of the picture.
So we're into just our last couple of minutes. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just go around and ask each person to say one sentence about something you're taking away from tonight's call. And I'll tell you the order so you're not taken by surprise. I'll tell you a couple of people in advance. We're just actually going to go in the order that's on my screen, but you don't know what that is, and we're all in different orders. So we will start with Radia, and then go to Sarah, and then William. And so Radia, will you kick us off? And then I'll give you the next three when we're done there.
Sure. So my takeaway is to be deliberate about the change that I want to see, and try to be less reactionary and more proactive about bringing about that change.
Thanks, Sarah, and then Bill.
Lots of great stuff, but I think my favorite takeaway from this evening is the comment that people are not for what they're for what they're against. I think that's extremely powerful and just so true. I work in urban planning, and it's a lot of stuff that people don't care about until it's a huge deal. So that's just so relevant for me.
Bill.
The main thing that I'm taking away tonight is that there's an awful lot of work to do. And one of the primary tasks I think that we have to do is to define what exactly is our goal that we're working for. It doesn't do any good to have all these organizing skills if we don't have an end goal in mind.
Amen. Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
And we'll go to Samuel, and then Shabuso, and then Ashley. Anybody can also pass if that's your need. Samuel, are you there? Or is that someone else with the 808 area code? Okay, we'll go to Chibuso.
I am going to spend time reflecting on why it is my environmental justice work appears to be very proactive, while my racial justice work seems to be overwhelmingly reactive.
Yeah, that's true.
And Ashley?
One thing I'm actually just going to take away from this is just the relationships. So it was so great to be in community with all of you, and I am selfishly wishing I could have been a small group with every one of you to get to know you more. But just grateful for the space and another lens of looking at this material with different eyes is always very enlightening. And so thank you.
So then it'll be Mr. Miller, and then Chris, and then me, and then David will have the last word. And Samuel, if you ever want to jump in, just go for it. So, Mr. Miller?
Yes, I enjoyed meeting all of you, new personalities who've been involved in the struggle, and I look forward to hopefully being in contact in the future to share and gather more information. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, you're on.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, just there's a very diverse group of people working on diverse issues, but all with nonviolence in mind, and all. I've been thinking of nonviolence as one of, not the only, but one of the bridges for business.
One of my takeaways is, in some ways, how simple this looks and how much discipline it takes to actually follow the methodology versus getting caught back in us and them and just, who can I get together to work on this thing with me, versus making my leadership cabinet of 72. It's really, it takes continuous discipline to actually apply this, but I see the power in it. So, Samuel, do you want to say a word here as we close?
Yeah, thank you I could listen, but my phone was not was not cooperating, and I was driving, so I could just hear you. So I made it to my garage. So, yeah, I think one of the things that my takeaway today is to always remember that you never stop mobilizing spectrum of allies.
Right.
Yes. You're constantly in the business of getting more people involved in a movement. And the last thing that David said really about the freedom, the group that he mobilized in Chicago, it's hit home. And now I'm asking myself, as I hear David speak about 50 years later, the group doesn't even know their history. I'm asking myself, 50 years from now, with CNCT, remember how we started in the city of Rockford.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Amen. Last word, David.
Well, I really had a lot of airtime in this conversation.
Why don't you said that since 1964, you've been thinking about the third and fourth generation trainers, and so we're here. So what do you want to say as a word of closing or blessing to
I want to say
who's gathered here?
One of the things I'm thankful for, and all of you are demonstrating it, is that you're going to take care of the next three generations. And you're going to see that people have more to say about nonviolence and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and this whole history of nonviolent ideas that maybe I couldn't even imagine 3 generations from now. But you folks are the carriers of it and the leadership for it. And I'm just happy to be part of you and to contribute what I can to this process. And so I just see each of these conversations, the community of practice, the webinars, and if we can ever get some support for the residential trainings, I just see them all as contributing to this process. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your investment in this, because it's only by this voluntary investment that this movement really continues to mature.
And Sarah said, when you said you'll take responsibility for the next 3 generations, Sarah piped right up, yes, we will, in the chat line. And we got some plus signs from Wendia right there. So as is our practice, anybody who wants to hang around for a few minutes to talk more or to debrief the meeting, which we always do because we're always doing this, so we always try to do it better. If you want to stick around for a couple minutes, you're invited. Otherwise, the call is formally over and we'll stop recording and all that kind of stuff. this recording will go up on YouTube. We will send out the slides, and we'll look for your involvement. And Facebook, correspond with me or Radia directly if you have follow-up questions. And it's good to be in the struggle together. So go in peace.
Thank you.